The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks through the kitchen window of the small house on Maple Street in Dover, Delaware. It was September 1944, and the war felt both impossibly distant and suffocatingly close. Eleanor Morgan stood at the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, washing the same plate for the third time, without realizing it. She wasn't thinking about the dishes. She was thinking about the letter tucked in her apron pocket, the one that had arrived that morning with the Army Air Force's insignia stamped on the envelope. Ellie, her neighbor Martha Caldwell, knocked gently on the screen door before letting herself in. That was how things were in their neighborhood. Doors were rarely locked, and friends didn't wait for invitations. "I brought some eggs from our hens," Martha said, setting a basket on the counter. Her eyes immediately found Eleanor's face. "Oh, honey, you heard from him, didn't you?" Eleanor dried her hands slowly, deliberately, as if the simple act could steady the trembling in her chest. She pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to Martha without a word. Martha unfolded the thin paper, her lips moving silently as she read. When she looked up, her expression was a mixture of sympathy and confusion. "Don't wait for me," Martha read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ellie, what does that mean? Why would James write something like that?" Eleanor had been married to Captain James Morgan for 3 years. 3 years that felt simultaneously like a lifetime and the blink of an eye. They'd met at a USO dance in Philadelphia in the spring of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before everything changed. He'd been a cocky young pilot with the Army Air Corps, all confidence and dimpled smiles. She'd been a secretary at a law firm, practical and cautious, the kind of girl who always looked both ways before crossing the street. They were opposites in every way that mattered, and somehow that made them perfect. "I don't know what it means," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "He's been stationed at RAF Lee in England for 8 months. His letters have been different lately. Distant, like he's already somewhere I can't reach." Martha moved closer, reading more of the letter. "He says he's going on a mission, a big one. But Ellie, he also says, if something happens to me, you deserve a life. Find happiness. Don't be shackled to a ghost." That doesn't sound like James. That sounds like a man who's already given up. "He hasn't given up," Eleanor snapped, surprised at herself with the sharpness in her tone. She took a breath, softening. "He's just scared. They're all scared over there." Martha folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked out the window at the elm tree in their small backyard, the one James had climbed the day before he shipped out, carving their initials into the bark like a schoolboy. "Yem plus jam forever." "I'm going to wait," she said quietly, "no matter what he says." 3 days later, the telegram arrived. Eleanor was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard Martha scream from across the fence. She dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and ran, her heart already knowing before her mind could catch up. The Western Union boy stood on Martha's porch, his face pale and apologetic. But he wasn't there for Martha. He was there for Eleanor. She took the telegram with hands that didn't feel like her own. The words blurred together, black ink on yellow paper. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Captain James A. Morgan, has been reported missing in action over Germany since 15 September stop. If further details or other information are received, you will be promptly notified. Stop. Missing. Not dead. Missing." Eleanor read it 3 times, searching for hope in the sterile military language. "He's not dead," she whispered. "They said missing. That means there's still a chance." Martha wrapped her arms around Eleanor, and for the first time since James had left, Eleanor allowed herself to cry. Weeks turned into months. Autumn gave way to winter, and the war dragged on with its relentless, grinding momentum. Eleanor received no further word about James. The Army sent her his personal effects, his watch, his wedding ring, a photograph of her that he kept in his flight jacket pocket, worn soft at the edges from handling. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her blouse where it rested against her heart. In January 1945, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't sit idle anymore, waiting for news that might never come. She took a job at the Dover Army Air Base, working in the communications office. It wasn't much, but it made her feel closer to James somehow, surrounded by pilots and planes and the language of war. It was there, filing reports and decoding messages, that she first heard whispers of Operation Aphrodite, a top-secret mission involving modified B-24 bombers loaded with explosives, piloted by volunteers on what many call suicide runs. Her supervisor, Major William Hayes, was a gruff man in his 50s who'd been declared too old for combat duty. He noticed Eleanor's sudden interest in the classified files. "That's above your clearance, Mrs. Morgan," he said gruffly but not unkindly. "Was my husband part of Aphrodite?" she asked directly. Hayes looked at her for a long moment, then closed the office door. "I can't confirm or deny anything about classified operations, but I will say this. Your husband was one of the bravest men I ever knew. Whatever mission he was on, he volunteered. Nobody forced him." Eleanor's throat tightened. Why would he volunteer for a suicide mission? We were building a life together. We talked about children, about after the war. "Because that's what men like James do," Hayes said quietly. "They believe in something bigger than themselves. And sometimes, Mrs. Morgan, loving someone means letting them be who they need to be, even if it breaks your heart." That night, Eleanor reread James's final letter by candlelight. She traced her fingers over his handwriting, trying to find hidden meanings in every word. "Don't wait for me. If something happens, you deserve a life. Find happiness." But beneath those words, at the very bottom of the page, was something she'd missed before, something that had been overshadowed by her grief and panic. In tiny, almost illegible script, James had written, "Always check the elm tree." Eleanor's breath caught. The elm tree, their tree, with their initials carved into the bark. She grabbed a flashlight and ran outside into the freezing January night. Still in her nightgown, Martha's confused voice calling after her from next door. Eleanor fell to her knees at the base of the elm tree, her flashlight beam dancing over the rough bark. There, just below their carved initials, was something she'd never noticed before, a small gap in the bark, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. With trembling fingers, she pried at the bark. A piece came loose, revealing a hollow space in the trunk. Inside was a small metal box, rusted at the edges but intact. Eleanor opened it with shaking hands. Inside was another letter, and a photograph, and a secret that would take 40 years to fully understand. Eleanor sat on the cold ground beneath the elm tree, the metal box open in her lap, Martha's flashlight now joining hers as her neighbor knelt beside her in the frozen darkness. "Good Lord, Ellie," Martha breathed. "How long has this been here?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted the photograph first. It showed James in his flight gear, standing in front of a B-24 Liberator bomber. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another pilot, a man with dark hair and a serious expression. On the back of the photo, in James's handwriting, Thomas Garrett. "If anything happens, he'll know." "Who's Thomas Garrett?" Martha asked. Eleanor shook her head, already unfolding the second letter. This one was longer, written on multiple sheets of thin paper, dated August 28, 1944. 2 weeks before the letter she received in the mail. "My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means you remembered. You always were smarter than me, paying attention to details I thought I could hide. I'm writing this in the barracks at 2 a.m., and I should be sleeping before tomorrow's briefing. But I need you to know the truth. Not the sanitized version they'll tell you if something goes wrong, but the real truth. I volunteered for a mission. I can't tell you the details. They'd black it out anyway. But it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything I've flown before. The odds aren't good, Ellie. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. You're probably angry with me right now. You're probably thinking, how could he volunteer to leave me? And you'd be right to think that. But here's what I need you to understand. Every day I'm over here, I see boys. And that's what they are, Ellie. Boys barely old enough to shave, getting blown out of the sky. I see cities bombed to rubble. I see people who've lost everything. And I keep thinking, what if I can do something that ends this faster? What if I can save even a dozen lives by risking mine? I know that sounds like propaganda, like something out of a war bonds poster. But it's the truth. I can't sit on the sidelines when I have skills that might make a difference. Now here's the part one needs you to really hear. If I don't come back, Thomas Garrett will come find you. He's my co-pilot, and he's a good man, married with a daughter back in Chicago. He knows things I can't write down. He'll explain everything when the war is over. But Ellie, if something happens to me, I meant what I said in that other letter. Don't wait. You're 25 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. I can't stand the thought of you growing old alone, frozen in time, mourning a ghost. Find someone who makes you laugh. Have the children we talked about. Live the life we planned, even if I'm not there to share it with you. I love you more than words can say. You made me believe in something bigger than myself, not the mission, not the war, but love. Real, honest, forever love. Always yours, James. P.S. There's a key in this box. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Philadelphia. Box number 247. Inside, you'll find everything you need. But only open it if I don't come back. Promise me, Ellie. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, spotting the thin paper. Martha squeezed her shoulder as Eleanor dug deeper into the metal box. Sure enough, at the bottom was a small brass key attached to a tag with the number 247. Philadelphia, Eleanor whispered. That's a 3-hour train ride. You're not thinking of going tonight, are you? Martha asked, alarmed. No, but soon. Eleanor carefully replaced everything in the box and stood, her nightgown damp from the frozen ground. I need to find Thomas Garrett first. If he survived. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the Dover Air Base with a renewed sense of purpose. Major Hayes looked up from his desk as she entered the communications office, noting the determination in her eyes. Mrs. Morgan, you look like a woman on a mission. I need to find someone, Eleanor said, setting her purse down. A pilot named Thomas Garrett. He was stationed at RAF Dilley with my husband. Do we have any way to track personnel records? Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her. That's irregular. Personnel information is restricted. Major Hayes, my husband left me a message. He said if anything happened to him, Thomas Garrett would have answers. I need to know if Lieutenant Garrett is alive, and if so, where I can find him. The major was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out a form. Fill this out. It's a request for information on next of kin notification. Technically, it's only supposed to be used for official military purposes, but... He paused. Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Morgan. I'll see what I can find. 3 days later, Hayes called Eleanor into his office and closed the door. Thomas Garrett, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. First Lieutenant, 8th Air Force, 704th Bombardment Squadron. He was aboard the same aircraft as your husband on September 15th, 1944. Eleanor's heart stopped. He survived. Barely. He was found by French resistance fighters 2 weeks after the mission, badly injured. He was held in a field hospital in France until November, then transferred stateside for recovery. According to these records, he was discharged in December due to injuries sustained in combat. Last known address, Chicago, Illinois. He's alive. Eleanor breathed. He made it back. Hayes nodded slowly. Mrs. Morgan, I'm going to tell you something off the record. Operation Aphrodite was a disaster. Out of 14 missions, only one achieved any meaningful result. The planes were flying bombs, modified B-24s packed with 25,000 pounds of Torpex explosives. The pilots were supposed to arm the explosives, set the plane on autopilot aimed at German targets, then bail out over friendly territory before the plane reached its destination. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. James was flying a bomb. Your husband and Lieutenant Garrett were the pilot and co-pilot on one of those missions. Something went wrong with the arming mechanism. According to Garrett's debriefing report, there was an electrical malfunction. The explosives armed prematurely. The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the edge of the desk. Hayes continued, his voice gentle but firm. James ordered Garrett to bail out immediately. Garrett's report states that Captain Morgan stayed with the aircraft to steer it away from a French village. The plane exploded over an empty field. There were no remains recovered. He saved a village, Eleanor said numbly. He saved hundreds of lives. And Lieutenant Garrett has lived with that knowledge every day since. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. I need to go to Chicago. I need to talk to Thomas Garrett. Mrs. Morgan. Major, my husband left me instructions. He knew something. And Thomas Garrett is the only person who can tell me what it was. Hayes sighed, then pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down an address. This is against regulations. But if anyone asks, you got this information elsewhere. Eleanor took the paper, reading the address. Thomas Garrett, 1847 North Cleveland Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. Thank you, Major. As she reached the door, Hayes called after her. Mrs. Morgan? Whatever you find out there, whatever your husband wanted you to know, some secrets are buried for good reasons. Be prepared for that. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood on the doorstep of a modest brick bungalow in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. It was late February 1945, and the war in Europe was entering its final, brutal phase. Snow was piled high along the sidewalks, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut through her wool coat. She knocked 3 times, her heart pounding. The door opened, revealing a man in his late 20s, thin and pale, with haunted eyes and a deep scar running down the left side of his face. He leaned heavily on a cane. Thomas Garrett? Eleanor asked. The man's eyes widened in recognition, not of her face, but of something deeper. You're Eleanor, James's wife. Yes. He stood there for a moment, emotions flickering across his face, grief, guilt, relief. Finally, he stepped back. Come in, please. I've been expecting you. The living room was warm, heated by a small fireplace. A young woman appeared from the kitchen, holding a toddler on her hip. Margaret, this is Eleanor Morgan, Thomas said to his wife. James's wife. Margaret's expression softened immediately. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thomas has told me so much about your husband. Please, sit down. I'll make coffee. Eleanor sat on the edge of the sofa, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. Thomas lowered himself into an armchair with visible difficulty, his legs stiff. You found the letter, he said simply. I found the box. In the elm tree. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. He made me promise. If he didn't make it back, I was supposed to find you after the war and tell you everything. But you found me first. He paused. Did you go to Philadelphia? To the bank? Not yet. I needed to talk to you first. To understand. Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped together. What do you want to know? Everything, Eleanor said. I want to know why my husband volunteered for a suicide mission. I want to know what happened up there. And I want to know what's in that safety deposit box in Philadelphia. Thomas took a deep breath. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he allowed himself to smile, a sad, knowing smile. Mrs. Morgan, your husband was the finest man I ever knew. And what's in that box is going to change everything you think you know about him. Margaret brought coffee, and Thomas began to talk. He spoke for 2 hours, barely pausing, as if releasing a dam that had been holding back a flood. He told Eleanor about the mission briefing, how James had raised his hand without hesitation when they'd asked for volunteers. He told her about the modifications to the B-24, the explosives packed into every available space, the crude remote control system that was supposed to guide the plane to its target after the pilots bailed out. We knew it was dangerous, Thomas said, but James believed in it. He thought if we could take out those V-2 rocket sites, we'd save thousands of lives in London. He described the flight over the English Channel, the tension as they armed the explosives, the crackle of static over the radio. Then everything went wrong, Thomas said, his hands trembling slightly. There was a spark, an electrical surge. The arming panel lit up like a Christmas tree. We had maybe 60 seconds before detonation. Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. James looked at me and said, "Get out, now." I argued with him. I said we'd both jump, but he pointed down. Thomas's voice cracked. There was a village directly below us. If the plane went down there... He stayed. Eleanor whispered. He stayed. He wrestled with the controls, forced the plane toward an empty field. I jumped at maybe 800 feet, barely high enough for my chute to open. I hit the ground hard, broke my leg in 3 places, shattered my hip. I heard the explosion before I even got the parachute off. The room was silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Thomas. Eleanor said carefully, "What's in the safety deposit box?" Thomas met her eyes. James was working with Army intelligence. Not officially. He was a spy or anything like that. But he'd noticed things. Patterns in the mission failures. Equipment malfunctions that didn't make sense. He thought someone was sabotaging the Aphrodite missions from the inside. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Sabotage. He kept records, documents, names, inconsistencies he'd noticed in maintenance logs and mission reports. He was afraid if something happened to him, the evidence would disappear. So he sent it all to that safety deposit box in Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? Because that's where you met. He said it was the only place that mattered, the only place that was truly yours together. He thought it would be safe there. Eleanor stood, pacing to the window. Outside, children were building a snowman in the fading afternoon light. The war felt both impossibly far away and suffocatingly present. Did he find proof? She asked. Did he know who was responsible? I don't know. He never had time to tell me everything. But Mrs. Morgan, Eleanor, you need be careful. If James was right, and someone was sabotaging those missions, they're still out there, and they won't want those documents to see the light of day. Eleanor turned back to Thomas, her jaw set with determination. Then I'll make sure they do. James didn't die so his discoveries could be buried. He died protecting people, believing in something bigger than himself. The least I can do is finish what he started. Thomas struggled to his feet, leaning on his cane. Then you're going to Philadelphia. Yes. When? Tomorrow. Thomas nodded slowly. Then I'm coming with you. I owe James that much, and you shouldn't do this alone. Margaret appeared in the doorway, having clearly been listening. Thomas, your leg. Margaret, I have to do this. Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. For James, and for all the other men who didn't come home. Margaret looked at her husband for a long moment, then at Eleanor, then back to Thomas. Finally, she nodded. Then I'm coming too. Someone needs to make sure you two don't get yourselves killed. The next morning, the 3 of them boarded a train at Chicago Union Station bound for Philadelphia. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the frozen landscape roll by, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. In her purse, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a brass key marked 247. Beside her, Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched against the pain in his leg. Across from them, Margaret bounced little Sarah on her knee, singing softly to distract the toddler from the long journey. Thomas, Eleanor said quietly, so Margaret wouldn't overhear. Would we open that box and find nothing? What if James was wrong? Thomas turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than grief in his eyes. She saw steel. Then we'll know he died a hero, and we can move on with our lives. Thomas said, But Eleanor, I flew with your husband for 6 months. I saw how his mind worked. James Morgan wasn't wrong about things that mattered. If he thought something was worth dying for, then it was... The train thundered east through Ohio, through Pennsylvania, carrying them toward a truth that had been waiting for 4 months in a small metal box in a Philadelphia bank vault. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but what they would find would change not only her understanding of her husband's death, but the course of her entire life. And decades later, when the full truth finally emerged, the world would learn that some heroes' greatest battles aren't fought in the sky, but in the shadows, where courage means standing up for truth, even when no one will ever know your name. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, February 28, 1945. The First National Bank on Market Street stood like a granite fortress against the winter sky. Eleanor, Thomas, and Margaret climbed the wide stone steps, Sarah bundled in blankets against Margaret's chest. Inside, the bank's vaulted ceilings and marble floors created an atmosphere of hushed reverence, as if they were entering a cathedral rather than a financial institution. Eleanor approached the clerk at the safety deposit box desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She presented the key, her marriage certificate, and James's death notification. The clerk, an elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the documents carefully. Box 247. Yes, this was opened by a Captain James Morgan in March of 1944, just before his deployment. I remember him. Polite young man, very serious. He looked up at Eleanor with sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Morgan. Thank you, Eleanor managed. The clerk led them down a narrow staircase into the vault, a windowless room lined with brass-fronted boxes. He used his master key in combination with Eleanor's key, and the door to box 247 swung open with a soft click. Take your time, he said, gesturing to a private viewing room. Ring the bell when you're finished. Eleanor carried the metal box into the small room. Thomas closed the door behind them, while Margaret settled Sarah on her lap in the corner. The three of them gathered around the narrow table. Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside was a thick envelope, a leather-bound journal, several photographs, and a smaller sealed envelope marked, "For Eleanor, open only if I don't come home." She opened that one first. My darling Ellie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm so sorry. I need to tell you something I should have said months ago, but I was afraid you'd try to stop me, afraid you'd be in danger if you knew too much. The Aphrodite missions are being sabotaged, not by the Germans, but by someone on our side, someone with access to maintenance records, flight plans, and technical specifications. I started noticing it in June. Small things at first, wiring issues that shouldn't happen, navigation equipment failures that defied explanation. Then I started comparing notes with other pilots. For missions that failed before crews could even bail out. For planes exploded prematurely, killing everyone aboard. The official reports blamed equipment malfunction, pilot error, bad luck. But Ellie, I'm a pilot. I know planes. These weren't accidents. I started keeping records. I documented every anomaly, every suspicious maintenance log entry, every pattern I could find. It all points to someone deliberately ensuring these missions fail. But I don't know who, and I don't know why. Maybe they're a German sympathizer. Maybe they're being blackmailed. Maybe they just want the program shut down. I don't have all the answers. What I do have is evidence. It's all in this box. Maintenance logs I copied, witness statements from ground crew, technical analyses, photographs of damaged equipment. If something happens to me, these documents need to reach someone who can investigate, someone you can trust. Major William Hayes at Dover Air Base. He's a good man, and he has the clearance to pursue this. Give him everything. But Ellie, you need to be careful. Whoever is doing this has killed at least 2 dozen men already. Don't put yourself at risk. Give the documents to Hayes and walk away. Promise me, I love you more than life itself. If I don't make it home, know that every moment with you is worth a lifetime. You made me a better man. Forever yours, James. Eleanor's tears spotted the paper as she set it down. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. He knew, Thomas said quietly. He knew the mission was compromised, and he went anyway. He was trying to protect people. Eleanor said, her voice breaking, even knowing someone might be trying to kill him. Margaret leaned forward. What's in the journal? Eleanor opened the leather-bound book. Page after page of James's precise handwriting filled the pages. Dates, times, aircraft tail numbers, descriptions of mechanical failures, names of maintenance personnel, observations about timing and patterns. June 12, 1944, aircraft 42 to 52,718. Electrical fire in autopilot system before takeoff. Maintenance Sergeant Howard Breslin signed off on electrical inspection 2 hours prior. Same sergeant signed off on 3 previous aircraft that experienced similar failures. July 3, 1944, spoke with Lieutenant John Fisher, pilot, mission number 4. He described hearing unusual clicking sounds from the arming panel minutes before explosion. Same sound reported by Lieutenant David Coleman, mission number 2, Kia, in letter to his wife 3 days before his death. July 18, 1944, examined damaged arming panel from aborted mission number 7. Found evidence of tampering. Wire insulation deliberately scored to cause short circuit. Photographed evidence, see photo number 8, reported to Captain Richards, who dismissed concerns as stress-induced paranoia. August 10, 1944, cross-reference maintenance logs for all failed missions. Pattern emerges. All aircraft serviced by same three-man crew in 72 hours before flight. Crew members: Sergeant Howard Breslin, Corporal Frank Delaney, Private Joseph Russo. Thomas paled as he read over Eleanor's shoulder. My God, he had it all figured out. He knew exactly who was sabotaging the planes. Eleanor flipped through the photographs. Close-ups of damaged wiring, maintenance log sheets with forged signatures, a picture of 3 men in mechanics' coveralls standing beside AB-24. On the back, James had written, Breslin, Delaney, Russo, Arpley, August 1944. We need to take this to Major Hayes, Eleanor said, her voice steady with purpose. Right now. But before they could leave Philadelphia, something happened that would change everything. As they exited the bank, a black Packard sedan pulled up to the curb. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, men with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Mrs. Eleanor Morgan? The taller one asked, showing a badge. Agent Robert Whitmore, Army Counterintelligence Corps. We need to speak with you about your husband. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Thomas instinctively stepped closer to her, his hand tightening on his cane. How did you know we were here? Eleanor demanded. We've been monitoring the safety deposit box since Captain Morgan's death was reported, Whitmore said. He contacted our office 3 weeks before his final mission, claiming he had evidence of sabotage within Operation Aphrodite. He was scheduled to meet with investigators, but he died before the meeting could take place. You knew? Eleanor's voice rose. You knew my husband suspected sabotage, and you let him fly that mission anyway? Whitmore had the decency to look uncomfortable. We advised him to stand down until the investigation was complete. He refused. He said if he suddenly withdrew from the mission, it would alert the saboteurs that someone was on to them. So he was bait, Thomas said bitterly. You used him as bait. He volunteered. Whitmore said quietly, against our recommendation. Captain Morgan believed that if he could complete the mission successfully despite the sabotage, it would prove the concept was sound and save the program. He didn't want 24 men to have died for nothing. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Did you catch them? The men who killed him. Whitmore exchanged a glance with his partner. Sergeant Howard Breslin died in a training accident 2 weeks after Captain Morgan's death. Corporal Frank Delaney was killed in action in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Private Joseph Russo is currently in a military prison awaiting trial for treason. Awaiting trial? Eleanor's voice shook with fury. My husband has been dead for 5 months, and that man is still alive? Mrs. Morgan, military justice moves slowly, especially during wartime. But I assure you, Russo will face a court-martial. The evidence your husband gathered is crucial to the prosecution. Whitmore paused. We need those documents. Eleanor clutched the leather journal to her chest. These are my husband's last words. His final mission. You're not taking them. Mrs. Morgan, this is a matter of national security. My husband died for national security. Eleanor's voice cracked. He died protecting people, exposing traitors, believing in something bigger than himself. And you want to bury his work in some classified file where no one will ever know what he did. Thomas placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Let them have copies. Keep the originals. They can't force you to give up your husband's personal effects. Whitmore considered this, then nodded slowly. Agreed. We'll photograph the documents here. You keep the originals. Fair. It took 3 hours in a rented office above a pharmacy. The counterintelligence agents photographed every page of the journal, every document, every photograph. They took statements from Eleanor and Thomas about what James had told them, about the mission, about everything. When it was over, Whitmore handed Eleanor a card. If you ever need anything, Mrs. Morgan, what your husband did, it matters more than you know. Eleanor tucked the card into her purse without looking at it. The war in Europe ended 3 months later, in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August. The world celebrated. streets filled with joy and relief and the wild hope of peace. Eleanor returned to her little house on Maple Street in Dover. She planted a garden beneath the elm tree where James had hidden his secrets. She went back to work at the law firm, typing briefs and filing documents. She never remarried. People asked, of course. Well-meaning friends, concerned relatives, even Major Hayes before he retired in 1947. But Eleanor always smiled politely and said the same thing. I had my great love. Some people never get that. I was lucky. She wore James's ring on a chain around her neck for the rest of her life. In 1946, Private Joseph Russo was convicted of treason and sabotage resulting in the deaths of 28 American servicemen. He was executed by firing squad at Fort Leavenworth in January 1947. The trial was classified. The public never learned the full story. Eleanor kept a leather journal in a locked drawer, reading it sometimes on quiet evenings, tracing her fingers over James's handwriting. Years passed. Decades. The world moved on, as worlds do. The 1950s brought prosperity and suburbs and the Cold War. The 1960s brought change and upheaval and men on the moon. The 1970s brought disillusionment and oil crises and questions about what America stood for. Eleanor grew older. Her hair turned gray, then white. Her hands developed arthritis. She moved a little slower, laughed a little less frequently, but never lost the quiet strength that carried her through the worst days of 1944. She volunteered at veterans organizations. She spoke at high schools on Veterans Day about the price of freedom. She never mentioned James's name publicly, never spoke of the sabotage or the investigation. That story remained classified, buried in military archives. But she never forgot. September 15th, 1984, 40 years after James's death, Eleanor was 84 years old, living in a small apartment in Dover with a view of the bay. Her health was failing. The doctors had told her she had maybe 6 months, a year at most. Her heart, they said, worn out after 8 decades of beating. She was at peace with it. She'd lived a long life, a good life. She'd made a difference where she could, helped where she was needed, and kept her husband's memory alive in the quiet ways that mattered. On the 40th anniversary of James's death, there was a knock at her door. Eleanor shuffled to answer it, leaning on her walker. On her doorstep stood an elderly man with white hair, leaning heavily on 2 canes, his left leg obviously artificial below the knee. It took her a moment to recognize him. Thomas. Thomas Garrett smiled, tears already streaming down his weathered face. Hello, Eleanor. They embraced, carefully, 2 old warriors greeting each other after too many years apart. Margaret had passed away in 1978. Thomas explained as Eleanor made tea. Sarah was grown now, with children of her own. He'd been living in a retirement community in Maryland, not far from Dover. I should have visited sooner, Thomas said, but it was hard. Every time I thought about seeing you, I thought about James, and... He trailed off. I know, Eleanor said softly. It's all right. Thomas set down his teacup, his hands shaking slightly. Eleanor, I came here for a reason. Something happened last month that you need to know about. He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket. The government is finally declassifying Operation Aphrodite records. It's been 40 years, long enough that most of the people involved are dead or retired. They're releasing documents about the missions, the failures, the investigation. Eleanor's heart began to race. They're releasing James's story? Yes, but there's more. Thomas opened the envelope and spread several documents across Eleanor's small kitchen table. I have a friend at the National Archives. He gave me early access to some of the files. Eleanor, there's something in here that the Counterintelligence Corps never told us. Something they kept hidden for 40 years. He slid a document toward her. It was a memorandum dated October 1944, marked classified, top secret. Eleanor put on her reading glasses and began to read. Memorandum for Director, Army Counterintelligence Corps. From Special Agent Robert Whitmore. Operation Aphrodite Sabotage Investigation. Final report. Date, October 15, 1944. Following the death of Captain James A. Morgan on September 15, 1944, this office conducted a comprehensive investigation into allegations of deliberate sabotage within the Operation Aphrodite program. Captain Morgan's documentation proved invaluable. Analysis of maintenance records, witness statements, and physical evidence confirmed systematic tampering with aircraft electrical systems by a coordinated sabotage cell operating at RAF Lee. 3 individuals were identified as members of the cell. 1. Sergeant Howard Breslin, deceased October 2, 1944. 2. Corporal Frank Delaney, deceased December 22, 1944. 3. Private Joseph Russo, in custody, awaiting court-martial. However, investigation revealed these individuals were not acting independently. They were recruited and directed by a fourth party, a commissioned officer with sufficient rank and clearance to access classified mission parameters and ensure maintenance crew assignments. Captain James Morgan identified this individual 3 days before his death. On September 12, 1944, Captain Morgan sent a coded telegram to this office containing a name: Captain Daniel Richards, Operations Officer, 704th Bombardment Squadron. Subsequent investigation confirmed Captain Richards had access to all compromised aircraft, approved all maintenance schedules, and was present at RAF Lee during every documented sabotage incident. Captain Richards was taken into custody on September 20th, 1944. During interrogation, he confessed to coordinating the sabotage operation but refused to reveal his motivations, stating only, "Some missions aren't worth the cost. Some prices are too high to pay." Captain Richards was court-martialed in November 1944 on charges of treason, sabotage, conspiracy to commit murder, and 28 counts of manslaughter. He was found guilty on all counts and executed by a firing squad on December 3, 1944. This matter is hereby considered closed. All documentation shall remain classified pursuant to national security protocols. Most significantly, Captain James A. Morgan's investigation directly led to the identification and prosecution of all parties responsible for the Operation Aphrodite sabotage. His actions prevented additional loss of life and exposed a significant security breach within the 8th Air Force Command structure. Recommendation: Captain Morgan should be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy action and conspiratorial threat. However, due to the classified nature of this investigation, such recognition must be delayed until appropriate declassification can occur. Respectfully submitted, Special Agent Robert Whitmore, Army Counterintelligence Corps. Eleanor's hands shook so badly the paper fluttered. Thomas gently took it from her and set it down. "He knew," Eleanor whispered. "He knew exactly who it was, and he flew that mission anyway. He was a hero, Eleanor. A real hero, not just for saving that French village, but for exposing a traitor that the Army couldn't touch without proof." Thomas pulled out another document. "And there's more." This came out last week. It was an official letter from the Department of Defense, dated September 1st, 1984. The President of the United States takes pride in presenting the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously to Captain James Andrew Morgan, United States Army Air Forces, for services as set forth in the following citation: for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving as pilot of AB 24 Liberator bomber in the 704th Bombardment Squadron, 8th Air Force, during Operation Aphrodite, in aerial flight over enemy-occupied France on September 15, 1944. Through meticulous investigation and at great personal risk, Captain Morgan identified systematic sabotage within his unit, documenting evidence that led to the exposure and prosecution of enemy sympathizers responsible for the deaths of 28 American servicemen. Despite knowledge that his aircraft had been compromised, Captain Morgan courageously completed his assigned mission and, when faced with catastrophic malfunction, voluntarily sacrificed his life to protect civilian populations below, guiding his aircraft away from inhabited areas before its destruction. Captain Morgan's unwavering dedication to duty, extraordinary courage under fire, and selfless sacrifice in the face of mortal danger reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Forces. Eleanor couldn't see the words any more through her tears. 40 years, she choked out. I waited 40 years to know the full truth. The ceremony is next month, Thomas said gently, at Arlington National Cemetery. They want to present the medal to his next of kin. He paused. Eleanor, you're his widow. You're supposed to accept the medal on his behalf. Eleanor looked up at Thomas, this man who had shared her husband's last moments, who had carried the weight of survival for 4 decades, who had come here today to finally close the circle. Will you come with me? She asked. I can't do it alone. Thomas reached across the table and took her weathered hand in his. Eleanor, I wouldn't miss it for the world. I owe James that much. We both do. October 20th, 1984, Arlington National Cemetery. The autumn leaves were brilliant against the white headstones, thousands upon thousands of markers stretching in perfect rows across the rolling hills. Eleanor stood beside James's grave, which she had visited exactly once before, in 1946, when his remains had finally been recovered from France and buried with full military honors. The headstone was simple. Captain James A. Morgan, U.S. Army Air Forces, 1918 to 1944, beloved husband, American hero. A small crowd had gathered, military officials, veterans representatives, a handful of historians interested in Operation Aphrodite, and media covering the declassification story. Thomas stood beside Eleanor, straight and proud despite his age and injuries. His daughter Sarah was there too, now a woman in her early 40s. With her own children, grandchildren Thomas had brought to witness history. A young lieutenant approached Eleanor with a folded flag and a wooden box containing the Distinguished Service Cross. Mrs. Morgan, on behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation, it is my honor to present you with this medal awarded to your husband, Captain James Andrew Morgan, for extraordinary heroism and service to his country. Eleanor accepted the box with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, revealing the bronze cross suspended from a blue and white ribbon. 40 years. She'd waited 40 years for this moment. The lieutenant stepped back, and a bugler played taps, the mournful notes carrying across the cemetery. As the final note faded, Eleanor knelt, slowly, painfully, and placed her hand on James's headstone. I waited, she whispered, so quietly only Thomas could hear. You told me not to, but I waited anyway, because you were worth waiting for. You were always worth it. She stayed there for a long moment, one hand on the cold marble, the other clutching the medal to her chest. Thomas helped her stand, and together they walked back to the rows of white headstones, 2 old soldiers who had fought different battles in the same war. Eleanor Morgan died peacefully in her sleep on March 3rd, 1985, 5 months after the ceremony at Arlington. She was buried beside James, their headstones side by side, their story finally complete. In her will, she left a leather journal, James's investigation notes, his final letters, all of it, to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, with instructions that would be displayed publicly so that future generations would know the truth about Operation Aphrodite, about sabotage and sacrifice, about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The exhibit opened in 1987. Thousands of people read James's words, saw his photographs, learned his story. Thomas Garrett lived until 1992, long enough to see James's heroism recognized in history books, in documentaries, in the stories told to wide-eyed school children learning about the cost of freedom. And in Dover, Delaware, on Maple Street, the elm tree still stands in the backyard of a small house. The bark has grown over most of the carved initials, but if you know where to look, you can still make out the faint outline. EM plus JM forever, because some loves transcend time, some sacrifices echo through generations, and some truths, no matter how long they're buried, will always find their way to light. Eleanor waited. She waited 40 years for the full truth about her husband's death, and in the end, the waiting was worth it, because love always is.